All right. Good afternoon. It's 12 o'clock. It's 12 o'clock on Wednesday, which means it's time for the Iowa Learning Farms Conservation Webinar. I'm Matt Helmers with Iowa State University and really excited to welcome Michelle Balmer. Michelle is with the um, Lake Restoration Program. She's a program coordinator there for the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. She's going to talk to us today about from the top of the watershed to the bottom of the lake restoration in Iowa. I think we all agree lakes are a really important natural resource in Iowa. So anything that's happening on lake restoration, I think is um, well, super cool for lack of any better more sophisticated term. So I'm certainly excited to hear the webinar today. We've tried to get Michelle for a while, so finally Elena was able to twist her arm to get her to talk. So with that, Michelle, the virtual floor is all yours. If folks have questions, please type those in the chat box and we'll get those to Michelle at the end of the talk. Okay, with that, nobody got on here to hear me talk, so it's all yours, Michelle.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me today. As Matt said, my name is Michelle Balmer, and I work with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, where I serve as the Lake Restoration Program Coordinator. Today, we're going to talk about lake restoration in Iowa, which is one of my very favorite topics. And hopefully we can walk through and we'll have a better understanding about what we are doing around the state and the partnerships that it takes to make our program run and be successful. So Iowa has a pretty long history of lake restoration, actually. The program was first created in 2006 by our state legislature, and it is funded principally through the Rebuild Iowa Infrastructure Fund and is an annual appropriation. This program was modeled after the federal Clean Lakes program that's kind of a piece of the Clean Water Act. And so we've kind of built on those successes that were built from the 70s through the 90s where funding was available and kind of taken it and run with it. In fact, we are kind of a national leader when it comes to lake restoration. We are really the only statewide state appropriation funded program where we deal with both water quality issues as well as aging infrastructure, overall ecological health, and with an eye on public recreation and amenity use as well. And to that end, we work to try and develop a 5-year plan to kind of map out where we're going next and what kind of projects we get to engage with around the state. Our team is a 2-person team, and Ben Dodd has just recently joined our team as well. So we're excited for what's to come in the future. So far, the legislature has been we've had really great support over the tenure of the 18 years that the program has been in place. So far, they've allocated a total of $167 million in state funding for restoration of lakes that are publicly owned throughout the state of Iowa. And we're able to leverage those funds. We have about a 35% cost share average by local partners, federal partners, many times local landowners. So there's a really strong push across the state to see restoration work. The photo here is just a great example of what can come through a project. This is a concert on Black Hawk Lake. They hold a summer concert series every year. And as the lake water quality has improved, that concert's become very popular. So you might be thinking, why work on Iowa's lakes? Well, as you might have guessed, lakes are an extremely important part of our local economy here. And we attract about 19 million visitors annually. Over 60% of all Iowans visit a lake each year, and most of the time, if they go once, they on average go a total of 8 times to one of our publicly owned lakes. So they're very important recreational destinations for folks across the state. With spending through all those visits, lakes contribute about $1 billion to our state economy. So they're a really important economic driver, not only for tourism and recreation, as well as the ecosystem services they provide to wildlife and fish, but they're also really important for driving our state's economy. And we know from surveys that we've conducted with Iowa State Center for Ag and Rural Development that lake users are willing to drive farther to visit lakes with better water quality and more amenities. And we also have the challenge that about 67% of our lakes are currently listed as impaired on Iowa's impaired waters list. And so we have a big lift in working at lakes across the state, trying to do what we see in the pictures below from Kent Park Lake in Johnson County, going from where we're seeing a lot of algal blooms in a turbid or cloudy water dominated state to a clear water dominated state where people can enjoy a lot of recreation, and we have booming fisheries and are able to attract and draw a lot of local wildlife for habitat. So the overarching goal of our program is really to try and provide long-term benefits to not only our lakes and reservoirs, but the people who visit them. Our program begins really with working with communities, and partnerships in community is something that you're going to hear me talk a lot about today, because it is the driving force behind the success of our program. And it's really the only reason why our program is able to be successful. Especially because most of our projects take anywhere from 5 to 10 years to complete from start to finish. And so a really passionate, locally driven group that is willing to champion the project and run with us for that full gamut of time is really important to helping us succeed. So we look at each project kind of independently, and we'll walk through how we prioritize lakes across the state for restoration. But all of our projects are kind of funded around this three-tiered stool of weight on public benefit, as in how will the public utilize this resource now and into the future with improvements? How are we setting up our lakes for the next generation of users? Feasibility, what physically can be done here? All watersheds and lakes come with constraints, and how can we work with and around those constraints to apply different restoration tools to allow us to be successful? And then water quality improvement needs. What does our water quality look like right now? And where do we hope to be? And what can we actually achieve in water quality improvements? And so you'll see here in just a second, we've worked on a lot of lakes across the state, and we love seeing big grand openings like at Easter Lake on the slide, as well as cooperator events where we're working with landowners and operators to try and implement watershed best management practices on the landscape, all in the hopes of bringing families like the kid you see in the picture to come out to our lakes and have a good time and really establish a love for our natural resources. So this is kind of how we walk through individually a lake restoration project. As I kind of indicated, we build all of our projects on that three-tiered stool of feasibility, public benefit, and water quality. And we really have a two-way street in how we identify lakes for inclusion within the program. Oftentimes, our fisheries management biologists or prominent community members or others will bring a lake to us and say, hey, this is a lake that I've been working on, or we see challenges here. What opportunities exist for us to make improvements? We work a lot with our parks staff. Many of the lakes and reservoirs or man-made lakes throughout our state anchor a county or a state park. And so we work a lot with our park staff to identify opportunities where maybe they're improving a campground and we see what can be done in the lake at the same time. Or we often walk through our own process and look at water quality metrics and changes in water quality in our publicly owned lakes over time to identify where needs exist for us to continue working. So a lot of times it's a mix of DNR identifying projects, but also a lot of communities coming to us and saying, hey, we love our local lake, but we think it needs some help. What can we do to work together? And ultimately, it results in that lake being prioritized within our 10-year plan. So that means we've made a commitment to try and gain some more information and figure out what's possible at this lake and whether or not we think we can be successful and what it might cost to actually achieve that. That's where we get to the second kind of graphic on the screen, where we go through our planning phase. Planning phase, honestly, could take anywhere from like a year to 5 years, depending on how much information you have when you start the process and how many partners are at the table and just what we need to get through to allow us to work both in the watershed and the lake. And this is, I'm so thankful that I get to talk to a group like this that talks about watershed land use and importance of implementing best management practices and how important the watershed is when you think about lake water quality. Really, anything that comes from the watershed ends up in the lake. So it's really important that we think about the watershed throughout a project and address watershed sources of nutrient and sediment pollution before and during while we work on a lake, because we know that's what's going to add to the longevity of that project. That planning stage often includes what we call a diagnostic and feasibility study, or essentially a scientific study that allows us to really go out and collect a lot of water quality data, do some modeling of the watershed, really get a better understanding overall of how this lake is functioning or not functioning, and where hotspots might be in the watershed that we can really target things like practices to try and improve water quality. This is also a really important part of the process when we think about identifying project partners. I'm really grateful that I get to work with a network of people across the state. County conservation boards, we work with the Soil and Water Conservation District and the NRCS on virtually every project that we tackle. Local park staff and local user groups. A lot of times we have friends groups or lake associations that are involved in projects, as well as individual landowners who are just passionate about seeing water quality improved in maybe their favorite fishing spot and want to make change on their own land that's going to impact downstream waters as well. So that initial planning process kind of gives us a roadmap of where we'd like to go and how we're going to work through that process. And then as we move through final planning, these projects often involve major construction as we're repairing infrastructure, and many times we're removing excess sediment or fixing shoreline along these lakes. So we have a lot of engineering work that goes through our program as well. And so as we step through that kind of engineering process, we learn a lot more about what it's going to take to do things, how we achieve that design to physically put it on the ground, and then what we think it's going to cost, and kind of work with our partners to develop planning budgets and timelines that will allow us to step through a project. And this is where we're so fortunate that we've had really stable funding from the legislature for a long period of time that allows us to take this iterative approach to walk through a project. So then we get to kind of what I call the fun part, where we're actually putting stuff on the ground. And that's really a two-pronged approach. First, we almost always try to work in the watershed first, or at least in tandem with in-lake work, especially in lakes where we know that the watershed is driving a lot of what's happening with in-lake water quality. And so this is where our partnerships are really, really critical. And I'm going to talk about a couple of examples of where we had strong partnerships and what we were able to achieve as a result of those strong partnerships here in a minute. But this most often looks like a coordinator or groups going out. A lot of times we really rely on the local districts and NRCS to help us with this. In working with local landowners and operators to identify and implement best management strategies on their ground, using a lot of cost share programs, things like EQIP, and WQI, all sorts of programs that would allow people to do things like manage tillage, maybe try cover crops for a first time, repair or put in new ponds on their landscape, grass waterways, terraces, all of those different watershed practices that really stop nutrients and sediment from moving downstream. This includes stream work too, things like stream restoration, stabilization, that will minimize the transport of those pollutants to the lake. And then finally, the in-lake piece. The vast majority of our lakes, really only about 35 natural lakes in the state, everything else we made. So the vast majority of our lakes are man-made lakes or impoundments or reservoirs. And the photo at the top right is a good example. That's Hickory Grove Lake in Story County. That means that they usually have a dam that's impounding water, much like a sediment pond in a watershed, just bigger. And we often drain or dewater the lake to work on those pieces. I'm going to show you examples of both a reservoir and a natural lake here in a minute. But implementation in the lake, we rely on those engineering designs to kind of walk through things like removal of excess sediment or dredging from the lake bottom. Here, we're actually covering the dam on Hickory Grove to install a low water drain, which will allow for future water management capabilities. Many times we think of these projects of how do we set up a lake for the next 50 years of its lifespan. The vast majority of the lakes in Iowa were created somewhere between the 30s and the 70s. And so many of them are hitting what I'm going to call retirement age. And just like your house, where you have to maybe put on a new roof every 30 or so years or renovate your kitchen, we have infrastructure updates that need to be made to our lakes as well. And so a big piece of any project that we tackle is updating and improving the infrastructure that will allow for better management for the next generation. The bottom photo is also from Hickory Grove Lake. That's a series of rock check dams that leads directly into the lake to try and reduce gully erosion within the park. One of the really important pieces of any park project that we work on is not only working with landowners on privately held parts of the watershed, but also trying to make sure that we are doing our part within publicly owned areas of the watershed, working directly on watershed practices in and around a lake on public land. We'll show you a couple examples in a couple minutes. But I wanted to highlight some of our program-wide accomplishments over the last 17 or so years. We've been really fortunate. I've had the opportunity to work in 72 lakes across 54 Iowa counties, and throughout the duration of our program, over 26 miles of shoreline protection have been implemented. Over 5 million cubic yards or 300,000 dump trucks of excess sediment have been removed from our lakes. We've done 38 shallow lakes projects, principally on the Des Moines Lobe area, looking at very large wetland complexes and shallow lakes that have enhanced over 14,400 acres of shallow lake habitat. These are really important for migratory waterfowl flyways, often provide important fisheries as well, and are really great for recreational amenities. Our program itself has funded more than 200 watershed best, Our program itself has funded more than 200 watershed best management practices, but that's a very small number when you think about all of our partners' work as well. So I would say that number is much closer to 1,000 or over 1,000 if we consider work that's been done by our partners as well as stuff that our program has directly invested in. In general, our program tends to fund practices on publicly held ground, and we rely on our partner network to help provide cost share for privately held ground. And then we've done about 45 infrastructure projects looking at things like dam or spillway repairs, outlet control structures, and fish barriers to try and minimize passage of carp and other fish that negatively impact the environment. The pie chart on the right really just kind of shows you a global picture of some of our expenditures. You can see that some practices are considerably more expensive than others when we come to implementation. Dredging, both natural or hydraulic dredging, and then in constructed lakes where we usually drain it and remove it manually with an excavator, are very expensive practices, as well as riprapping or stabilizing shorelines to prevent erosion. We've done quite a bit of shallow lake management, some infrastructure updates, and then we're continually looking for new ways to invest in our lakes and new tools to use to try and improve water quality. We'll talk a little bit about some of those as well. So when we think on a global scale across the state, this really gives you a snapshot of where we've been and where we're going in the next few years. All of the dots kind of correspond with the level of funding that our program has also implemented as a part of an individual project. So the larger the dot or the point on the map, the larger the investment. And you can see that all the green ones are ones where we're currently working to develop projects, or we may be starting that initial implementation stage, as well as we've got a suite of lakes where we're currently working. If you drive around the state today, you might notice that water is really low at Lake Keoma or Lake McKinley, both in southwest Iowa or southern Iowa. Because we have active dredging projects at both of those. We have a large watershed project in the park at Diamond Lake in Powesheik County, and we really capitalize on winter work to move sediment out of Lake Basin. So we work year round with our partners. And then we've got a number of projects that we consider in maintenance. We never really walk away from a project. Our goal is always to re-engage with the community if additional issues come up or as we continue to learn about lakes. And so that's, I think, a really important part of our program is constantly making a commitment to continue to invest in lakes where needed. So I want to walk through a couple of examples throughout the tenure of our program. This is Lake Geode. Lake Geode's in southeast Iowa. It's a pretty large impoundment, 174 acres, and it has a watershed to lake area ratio that's one of the largest ones that we've worked on. We've found over the duration of the program that when the watershed is relatively small to the size of the lake, we can usually see greater success. So this was a big challenge in that we had a very large watershed to work with. There are a lot of steep slopes and highly erodible soils in Southeast Iowa, but we had great partners that helped us walk through this project. And I want to shout out especially Caleb Waters. Caleb was the watershed project coordinator for over 10 years, I believe, at Lake Geode, and really allowed this project to be successful. He coordinated a lot of the local partnerships as well. Lake Geode was constructed in the 1950s, and it's a really popular state park. It draws over 180,000 visitors each year, but throughout its lifespan, it's lost a lot of volume in that upper end of the lake. We saw quite a bit of gully erosion in the park. There were some shoreline erosion issues, and it really had a poor fishery, not a lot of recreational opportunities for people to take advantage of. So it was a really good candidate for investing in a lake restoration project. The project really began in 2008 with a watershed plan and subsequent project funded through a grant from the US EPA in their Section 319 program. And this is really what allowed Caleb to do his work. His work was principally funded by the Section 319 grant. He also worked really heavily with the local Soil Water Conservation District and NRCS office. We had a couple of major goals as a part of that watershed project. First, to reduce phosphorus delivery by over 6,000 pounds a year and sediment by almost 2,500 tons a year. Those are really lofty goals to try and get us to our water quality improvement goal within the lake. A TMDL was also developed to try and roadmap where hotspots were within the watershed and how we might address those over the course of the project. And you can see that Caleb and our local partners were extremely successful in implementing watershed improvements. 98 watershed pest management practices were installed, including terraces, stream restoration, ponds, grass waterways, a lot of cover crops that really helped slow the transport of nutrient and sediments to the lake. Phosphorus was, of course, the principal nutrient of concern here, but we also had a lot of challenges with sedimentation. Over $1 million of federal 319 funding was incorporated into this project and invested in that watershed. And this is a really big piece for me. Almost $400,000 of private landowner funds and operator funds were invested as well, which shows just the incredible partnership that we were able to achieve at Lake Geode. And Caleb was able to drive that success in people making investments on their own land that not only benefited hopefully their own operations, but also the water quality in downstream Lake Geode. And because of all this, we actually exceeded our sediment and nutrient goals. And if you remember, they were pretty lofty goals to begin with. So through this project, we were able to achieve over 7,000 pounds of phosphorus reduced annually and over 5,000 tons of sediment that were being kept out of Lake Geode as a part of those watershed pest management practices. As I kind of indicated earlier, our program sees that it's very important, and we work very hard with our partners to not only work to address things on privately owned land, but also publicly owned land. And Lake Geode is a really good example of that. As a part of the project, 29 ponds were installed within the state park footprint or bordering private land and state park that really also helped reduce those sediment and nutrients. We think it's important to set an example and to try and work with our partners to implement practices where we can on public land too. And so when we get to that in-lake piece, we can see that we removed almost 200,000 cubic yards of excess sediment. The photo on the top right is a pretty typical view of what we see during construction, where we're dredging part of that lake bottom. Usually we're dealing with some pretty soft sediment that's been deposited over time. And we had several spoil locations around the park where material was placed and is being turned into native prairie on the back end as those slopes have dried out. Almost 8,000 feet of shoreline was also stabilized. In that bottom left photo, you can see areas where there's a lot of riprap that has been placed to not only provide fish habitat, as fish used to like to use those spaces in between the rocks, but it also prevents shoreline erosion and sedimentation and turbidity that comes from that wind wave action and ice heave constantly on the shoreline of the lake. There was a lot of infrastructure improvements here as well. That photo of the crane in the center shows how we were replacing the gate valve within the lake. And then we really utilize a lot of partnerships and volunteers as a part of many of our projects as well. And so the photo there shows some students building a catfish condo out of some tile lines. We put a lot of artificial habitat in some of our lakes to try and really provide good habitat for our fishery. The fishery was completely renovated as a part of this project, and we have a really good fishery that's kind of taken off at Lake Geode since. We also piggybacked with parks on this project. The bottom right photo shows that the campground went through a major restoration and renovation at the same time we were working in the lake, which really helped minimize disruption for users. To that end, this was a big project for us. There was a total investment from all the project partners of over $6 million. You can see that it's a beautiful place to visit on a fall afternoon now, as the top photo shows, and you can see that shoreline work that was put in place. It's been a great source of pride for the local park manager, Ulf, who will proudly give tours of all of the work that has occurred there. And we even got the governor and the director to come out and help stock fish in the lake. So that was really a really great piece for the project. But these projects take an incredible amount of time. This is kind of just a snapshot timeline of how we worked through that Lake Geode project, starting with that watershed plan all the way through completing in-lake park improvements and reopening the park to the public. So it's really important that we think about our long-term strategy and engage those partners and the public throughout that process to try and walk through that. The other example that I kind of want to talk about is Black Hawk Lake up in Sac County. Black Hawk is almost 1,000. It's 922-acre naturally glacially formed lake, and this one has a much smaller watershed to lake area ratio. Many of our natural lakes do. The project started with a diagnostic feasibility study that was completed with Iowa State in 2010, and this lake holds a really special place in my heart, as I was a graduate student at the time and got to work on that DF study. So I feel like I've seen this one through from start to finish in different parts of my own career. The Watershed project there began in 2012, and we've had a number of really great coordinators there. Most recently with Ethan Tees, who's really kind of led through this graph down at the bottom kind of shows all of the different funding partners for watershed implementation over the tenure of the watershed project there. This project again was funded, the coordinator was funded principally by a Section 319 grant from the US EPA that's administered by the DNR in our watershed improvement section. This again highlights some of the partnerships that we build as a part of a project. And the graphic on the right is really showing where all of the practices have been implemented in the Black Hawk Lake watershed through those coordinators' efforts. Together, they have been able to show at least one practice in over 61% of the watershed. So we've had really, really high adoption rates here because of their efforts. And there's been an ongoing monitoring project that we've engaged Iowa State with. Dr. Michelle Sapir's lab has been working on for years to look at paired watershed studies and really understand how some of the practices like prep wetlands are helping reduce nutrient loads to Black Hawk Lake, most principally nitrate, which is a big area of concern up in that Des Moines Lode watershed, as well as looking at water quantity reductions and sort of resilience on that landscape from those wetlands being implemented. And then we get to the in-lake portion. This was also the diagnostic feasibility study kind of walked through a variety of steps that we could take over the long term to try and improve water quality in the lake. And so we've had two dredging projects there actually. First, for the main body of the lake that's relatively shallow, we took 750,000 cubic yards of excess sediment out of that main body that increased depth. We had a lot of wind resuspension of sediments that increased or decreased water clarity and really increased turbidity. And so doing some modeling showed us really that increased depth would help reduce that turbulence and allow for vegetation to establish. Similarly, we removed almost 300,000 cubic yards from the lake's wetland inlet and meandered it, re-meandered the channel, which really allowed us to slow nutrients and sediment as they entered from the watershed to the lake. This is also an incredible area for nitrate processing. If you took nitrate samples from the inlet, At the top of the inlet, you'd see that they were often quite high, and they were almost always less than 1 milligram per liter at the bottom of the inlet as they entered Black Hawk Lake. So these wetland areas can be really important for processing nitrate. One of the other major components of this project was minimizing and eliminating carp from the system. Carp, especially in our shallow natural lakes, can be really detrimental to water quality. They are bottom feeders and uproot a lot of vegetation as a part of their feeding behavior. And they like to go into inlets to spawn and then compete. So we have a lot of niche space in the total food web kind of taken up by these fish that aren't really used by a lot of anglers and can actually negatively impact water quality. So 3 fish barriers were installed as a part of this project. This photo on the bottom shows the large barrier between the inlet and the lake that prevents migration to allow them access to their spawning habitat. And the lake was actually chemically renovated in 2012 to completely remove carp from the system. Carp have unfortunately been reintroduced, but we're actively working now on monitoring population movements of carp within the lake in hopes of developing new strategies to manage their numbers. Over 215 watershed best management practices were installed as a part of this project, and this is a very large investment. The local Lake Protective Association, I want to shout out especially here, who has championed the project from start to finish, including help fund that diagnostic study way back in 2010. Over $18 million has been invested and about $10 million from the Lake Restoration Program. And you can see big changes in water quality at Black Hawk, and there's now a booming fishery. The walleye at the top has been reintroduced, and we're seeing really, really incredible walleye fisheries, and now a booming muskie fishery at Black Hawk. And we've talked about this a little bit, but the importance of partnerships for both lake and watershed protection are really critical to our program's success, and I think a good tie-in to the Iowa Learning Farms message. There's a photo of Caleb, actually. We work really hard to try and engage with our local partners and apply that two-pronged approach of working on private and public areas of the watershed, as well as investing within the lake itself. And then, just a shout out to all the watershed coordinators across the state. Really, we've seen that the extent of practice implementation is really dependent on where we are able to have a local coordinator in place that's able to really engage with local landowners and operators. And they're really key to our program's success. So I just want to highlight a couple other successes that we've seen over the years as a result of some of those watershed partner efforts. At Easter Lake, that top right photo is a very urban landscape located within the Des Moines Metro. That we've had several coordinators there, most recently Julie Peralt. Together, the coordinators there were able to install over 200 urban practices that accounted for about 66% of the sediment reduction goal and almost 90% of the phosphorus goals outlined in the TMDL. This is a major stream bank stabilization project that took place along Yater Creek, where we partnered with the city of Des Moines to help implement these big changes. There was a really, really big gully erosion throughout that creek that led directly to the lake, and so this has been a really big piece. At Lake of the Hills, over in Scott County or Westlake County Park, a lot of practices were installed around the park as a part of the project that got us halfway to meeting our TMDL goals just with watershed park practices for phosphorus reduction. And that middle photo shows one of the many ponds that was implemented within the park. And Rathbun Lake has been an ongoing place where we've invested a lot of work and work really heavily with our local partners. We're very thankful for the coordinators, Brian and Velvet, who have implemented so many practices on the ground with local landowners and operators, and the longstanding partnership we have with the Rathbun Regional Water Association and the Rathbun Land and Water Alliance, principally John Glenn and Marty Braster. Over $18 million have been invested there throughout the tenure of the project. We currently are also working on 3 projects in the watershed and at the lake itself with the Army Corps of Engineers. And that bottom photo shows a tour where the colonel was able to come down and visit where we hope to implement some of these projects over the next few years. Just a few more at Lake Darling. That top photo shows some of the gully erosion that we saw in the watershed prior to starting the project. There were a number of watershed practices that were implemented there and numerous ponds throughout the landscape before the in-lake work began, reducing sediment delivery by about 60%. And at Clear Lake, Ventura Marsh is a major wetland complex that leads into Clear Lake, which is a natural lake up in northern Iowa. And we partnered with the Army Corps of Engineers there as well to try and reduce inputs to the lake itself, and as well as being able to install pumps to have wildlife be able to manage water levels for migratory waterfowl and aquatic species. And then finally, I'll just highlight the Iowa Great Lakes up in Northwest Iowa. There's been a lot of work there with their coordinator, John Wills, and there's been pretty extensive wetland restoration throughout the Iowa Great Lakes watershed. We're currently working with the University of Iowa on really understanding the hydrology of the Iowa Great Lakes, mirroring both surface water hydrology and groundwater hydrology to better target practices moving forward. But the bottom right photo is just an example of one of the stormwater wetlands that has been put in place throughout the years. So just a couple metrics of water quality improvement from our restoration projects throughout the state. In over 70% of our, we've seen improvement of water clarity in over 70% of our projects following restoration, and the average improvement is about a foot and a half of water clarity. So I like to think when you go to a lake, you want to be able to walk out to about your waist deep and see your toes. And if we can get halfway there where we couldn't before, that's a step in the right direction. Many of our restored lakes meet their water clarity goal of 4.5 feet for half of that recreational season for the first time following a a restoration project. And for lakes to meet that target, on average, they're meeting it more than once every 3 years. We also work on a lot of shallow lakes in Northwest Iowa, principally. Those photos on the right show a before and after of West Hodis Lake, which drains directly into West Okoboji Lake, and that's a wetland complex up there. And in all of the 38 shallow lakes that we've worked on, we've seen water clarity improve by over 50% in all the 12 lakes where we have both pre and post data. And we're usually picking up about 3 feet of additional water clarity in those lakes. We're also seeing reductions in total phosphorus concentrations, nitrate, and especially that organic nitrogen. And then chlorophyll A, which we use to measure production or algal growth. We see really, really strong dips as we convert from a turbid water state to a stable clear water state with a lot of aquatic vegetation that benefits wildlife. So this is kind of what we've been working on over the last couple of years. These are just a couple of the projects that we've been implementing around the state. On the top left, there's a stone terrace that will provide really good accessible access to Casey Lake in Hickory Hills Park in Black Hawk County. We always are working to improve fisheries, and this is just a great example of kids getting out and enjoying the fishery at Prairie Rose Lake following the restoration project. We've had 2 major shoreline projects this past year, one at Rock Creek Lake in Jasper County and an ongoing one at Silver Lake in Dickinson County. I was really critical, especially at Silver Lake this past year with all of the flooding. Some of those shoreline efforts really prevented major erosion that we saw in some of the other Great Lakes. And then, as I kind of indicated earlier, the ongoing dredging project at Lake Keoma in the bottom left. So we're always looking to the future, and these are some of the projects that we have kind of on the docket for the future. As many of you know, the Great Lakes experienced really dramatic flooding in 2024, and we are working hard with local and federal resources to try and repair shorelines and prevent additional shoreline erosion, especially around West Okoboji Lake, where there were, many, many sites where we had dramatic shoreline erosion. We're also working actively at Diamond Lake in Poweshiek County. We're currently developing a plan for in-lake work, and we're actively doing projects within the watershed. Additionally, we are going to be working at East Twin Lake in Hancock County as a shallow lake project to try and repair that structure that you see in the photo and give the shallow lake new life. And then we're also investing in a new strategy for Iowa to combat internal phosphorus recycling, investing in alum treatments on the lake, which binds phosphorus and really helps reduce some of those algae blooms. So with that, I'll take whatever questions you guys have. I thank you all for joining me today, and your attention.
All right, thanks, Michelle. Let's move to, if we can get to like the last couple slides, I'll try to get through those quick. If you watch this webinar live and would like to earn a CCA CEU, please email Alena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, ALENAW at iastate.edu. We can go to the next slide. Should be if you watch this webinar live and are willing to fill out a voluntary demographic survey, we would greatly appreciate it. Just one is needed for 2025 webinars. So if you've done that, thank you very much. If you're willing to do so, you can scan that QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. We greatly appreciate that as well. Next slide. Okay, we got Dr. Adina Howe talking about our agricultural microbial neighbors. So we're going from nematodes last week, talking about lakes this week, to our microbial neighbors. So don't say there's not diversity in topics on the Iowa Learning Farms webinar. So please tune in next week. And I think we might have one last slide about if you're ever wondering, I want to go back and watch a webinar if you missed something. These are archived on the iowalearningfarms.org website, or on, we have a YouTube channel specifically for webinars with Iowa Learning Farms. So thank you very much for attending. Now we'll get to the questions for Michelle. And there were a couple questions in here along the same line that people wondered what happened with that dredged sediment, and was there, and then you made a comment about maybe putting that out and seeding prairie, whether there was anything that needed to specifically be done with that before seeding on it.
Sure, that's a great question. And it kind of depends on the type of dredging we're doing. So if we're doing a hydraulic dredging project, we usually build a basin with berms and you're pumping a slurry of water and sediment where it has to dewater and drain down. A good example of this is Blue Lake out in Western Iowa, where it's a very sandy composite too, and it's dewatered over the past couple of years, and now we're to the point where it's dried out enough where we can knock the berms down, regrade the slope, and we'll be reseeding it to sand prairie. Our wildlife biologist Doug Chafe is kind of leading those efforts, and then in areas where we have more compact sediment and we are able to do mechanical dredging, it kind of depends on how wet the sediment is when it comes out, how high you can stack it. And I'd be willing to bet that if you drove around, you wouldn't be able to find our spoil sites in most of our mechanical dredging projects after a couple of years. It usually only takes 1 to 3 years and we'll do a cover crop like rye on it the first year, let it dry out for a couple of years. We often stack anywhere from 5 to 10 feet deep, depending on the structure of the soils that we pull out of the bottom of the lake. And then we usually work to reseed it to native prairie using like native ecotype mixes. And we rely really heavily on local wildlife biologists or county conservation board naturalists kind of to drive what mix should be incorporated there. Okay. If you're familiar with Hickory Grove Park, you can drive around the park and the spoil site is within the park and it'll just look slightly higher than the rest of the landscape. On Easter Lake, as you drive in on Easter Lake Drive, one of our spoil sites is on the hillside as you drive into the park or drive towards the park. And I'd be willing to bet you wouldn't know that that's a spoil site. We do tend to see that because of the structural integrity, prairie and reseeding tends to be a more favorable use. We really haven't seen the structure that's allowed us to then build on spoil materials following projects. But there are other ways of repurposing it.
Okay, I was kind of curious whether anybody's applied it thinly out in agricultural fields. Somebody said that brought up there might be some nutrient value in that soil.
Yeah, we get that question a lot, and the principal challenge for that is the most expensive part of any dredging project is the movement of material from one location to the next. And
Okay.
so when we're talking the really large quantities that we generally are working with of 100,000+ cubic yards, it's just not practicable to be able to broadcast it over large
Yeah.
areas,
Okay.
because you're increasing your transport costs exponentially.
Yeah.
I do think it's a really viable strategy on really small areas where you're only removing a small amount of material. And then, yes, it does have nutrients. The only challenge there is you have to worry about things like how waterlogged are those sediments, and are you going to be able to incorporate them into the other soils to where they don't negatively impact drainage or your tillage or anything like that.
Okay. Another one for county governments interested in supporting lake restoration efforts. Can you give some examples of the kinds of support they could provide?
Oh, yeah. I mean, certainly work with your county conservation boards if you have a lake or lakes of interest within your county. Um, Give me a call. My information's on the screen. We're always happy to talk through anything. And then any efforts that really champion water quality improvement in the state are excellent. I'd say that I don't know how much engagement there is too between county boards and some of our local districts, but I think there's opportunities there as well. And then I'm just going to put one more plug out there for the publicly owned lakes fund that's administered by our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, but our program has a hand in as well. Grants go out this spring, and that's a fund that kind of funds practices upstream on private land in watersheds, and is a great place for counties to work with local districts to try and get money for additional practice cost share support. So that would be a place where you would look into. I'm happy to provide any additional information after this too about that.
Okay. Um, are there some unique challenges that are faced when doing restoration of natural lakes versus maybe those that are like Hickory Grove Lake in Story County that's a reservoir there?
Yeah, I think there are a couple. I think my approach is a little bit different with a natural lake than it is a man-made system, just in, how much engineering are you willing to do on something that's a natural formation versus something that was created by man? It's more of a philosophical conversation, but we don't have the ability often to dewater our natural lakes like we do with a man-made lake. So when it comes to projects like dredging, they're considerably more expensive, and it's more challenging to locate a spoil site and build a spoil site for those types of lakes. Similarly, when we have the ability to manipulate levels, we can draw lakes down to more easily complete things like fishery renovations, which is considerably more challenging in our natural lakes. Natural lakes often have a different set of regulatory standards as well when it comes to boating and usage. And so, where we have a lot of control in some of the man-made lakes with respect to the types of motors or wake speed, that's governed in state code for our natural lakes as to what is and is not appropriate, and may not always align with what's best for the ecosystem. So, when you think about wake boats and how much they can influence resedimentation or resuspension of sediments or shoreline wave action. Those are challenges. And then the final piece is the vast majority of our man-made lakes are in the center of a state-owned or county-owned park where there's very little development around the shoreline outside of the park area. So we have a lot more control, I would say, of the immediate watershed and shoreline. Many of our natural lakes have a lot of houses on them, and that's great. It's great that people can have homes there and enjoy those lakes. But it presents a unique set of challenges of how we address things like shoreline erosion or water going directly into the lake from those adjacent properties. And so it's just a different kind of partnership that we're building with landowners on a lot of our lakes when we have housing around those shorelines.
Is the engineering work done on these projects by DNR, private engineering firms, or a combination of the two?
A combination of the two.
Okay.
We're really fortunate in that we have a really great design team at DNR and that engineers quite a bit of our projects. And then we work with a variety of partners to do engineering. We will often solicit RFPs for outside engineering from consultant firms where we need specialized research or we've hit capacity internally. We often work with other partners. So a lot of times a county or a city will release an RFP for a consultant. And then it's really nice to have kind of an independent third-party consultant walk through design. We've relied on engineers from both counties and cities in the past for design and oversight with implementation, as well as like our federal partners. The Corps often does design on any Corps related project. And then we have other non-government or nonprofit partnerships that we work with. We work a lot on our shallow natural lakes with Ducks Unlimited, where the engineering staff at Ducks Unlimited provide a lot of the design support for those projects at a greatly reduced rate as a part of their partnership with DNR.
How does the DNR define shallow lakes versus regular lakes?
Oh, that's a really tough one,
Okay.
or what we call a lake versus a wetland in
Yeah.
general. Unfortunately for me, our legislative code has kind of spelled it out for my program and how we work through it. So a shallow natural lake that's going to be something that our program would work on has to be larger than 10 acres. Um, and principally has a lot of vegetation or would have aquatic vegetation for a large portion of the basin, a large littoral zone if we're able to remove things like fish that actively uproot those plants. Usually has a mean depth of less than a foot and a half, or excuse me, less than a meter and a half. So pretty shallow, like 3 feet to 5 feet. Many of these are not hitting 10 feet anywhere. And many of our lakes are pretty shallow when we think about lakes countrywide, but yeah, we're getting into territory where mean depths are more in line with 8 to 12 feet.
All right. How do you determine the reduction in sediment and phosphorus inflow?
We've used a variety of different strategies. In some of our lakes, we've had the capacity to be able to do monitoring throughout the watershed on the front end of a project, like a diagnostic feasibility, where we've set up a network of flow meters and take periodic samples at different points in the hydrograph that allow us to really estimate loads. We've also utilized a lot of modeling, SWOT modeling and other watershed models to look at inputs, as well as in-lake modeling. And we're exploring a lot more of the in-lake modeling piece to try and get a handle on it. And then we've relied pretty heavily on the sediment delivery calculator that was developed and utilized a lot with DNR watershed improvement staff to document like what we think reductions from individual practices are going to look like to try and estimate those reductions in sediment and phosphorus loads to the lake.
There was somebody curious about the alum phosphorus treatment, whether this differs from previously used phosphorus removal techniques.
Yeah, alum is kind of a new tool for us, although it has been utilized pretty extensively throughout the United States for almost 40 or 50 years. Our partners to the north, both in Minnesota and Wisconsin, invest pretty heavily. And it's most appropriate in places where we have the right type of sediment and phosphorus being released from the sediment.
Okay.
That's kind of a complicated question, but we've taken a lot of sediment cores to try and ascertain whether or not we have the right type of sediment that's going to be inactivated by aluminum sulfate or sodium aluminate, depending on what our pH constraints are, kind of dictates what product we would be applying in the lake. We have used alum once in the state before at Carter Lake over in western Iowa, or arguably Nebraska in Omaha. That's an oxbow lake on the Missouri River. And we're going to be applying it to Green Valley Lake and Prairie Rose Lake starting this spring. We've done pretty extensive work looking at internal loading rates, and that's where alum is most often used and most appropriate, especially in lakes where you have stratification or you have deep waters that are cold and go anoxic for large portions of the season. That's where we typically see really strong pulses of nutrient release from the sediments or phosphorus release. That soluble phosphorus, when the lake turns over, can really drive a lot of algal blooms. And if that happens periodically throughout the summer, it can lead to kind of a perpetual algal bloom cycle. And so we're using alum in a couple of these lakes where we have good sediment chemistry that's really applicable. We know how far down in that sediment column we're seeing rates of phosphorus and their release rates, and then can dose it accordingly to try and inactivate that phosphorus. the aluminum in that alum binds directly to the phosphorus molecule and creates a pretty strong ionic bond and settles as a flock at the bottom of the lake. So it's relatively inert and a lot more stable than phosphorus sorbed to a sediment particle that can desorb under different redox conditions.
Okay. You brought up Carter Lake as an oxbow. Does the DNR lake restoration program include the restoration of former oxbows, and do they count as lakes?
My limnological wearing
Yeah.
hat would
Yeah.
count them very much as lakes,
Okay.
as oxbows are cut off channels from
Yeah.
rivers where they've kind of meandered. Certainly very large oxbow lakes we work on across around the state. Principally, we've worked on Blue Lake, which all of these are oxbows on the Missouri. So Carter Lake, Blue Lake, Lake Manawa, those are all oxbow lakes in western Iowa. But I think the question is more targeted towards the really small oxbow lakes, especially throughout central Iowa, where I know Nature Conservancy and other partners have been working.
Hmm.
Our program doesn't work directly on those, although I've certainly really enjoyed seeing the trajectory and the restoration of those smaller oxbow lakes, especially for targeting species of conservation need like the Topeka shiner.
All right. All right, Michelle, I think in the interest of time, we will stop there. I think that we got most of the questions answered, and really greatly appreciate your presentation and willingness to answer questions and stay on for almost close to an hour. So, folks, if you need a CCA CEU, you probably know the drill, but email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW, at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with the name you used when you entered the webinar, your CCA number, uh, and tune in next week for Adina Howe to talk about microbes. With that, I hope everybody has a great rest of the day and great rest of the week. Thank you again, Michelle, for an excellent presentation, and huge thanks to yourself and all those involved with the lake restoration projects. Vitally important, and it was great to highlight that today.
Thank you. If you have additional questions, my information is there as well, so you
Okay.
can always feel free to email me.